The footage had been running for 4 minutes before anyone in that room said a single word. I had been the last person they called. That should tell you something about how bad the situation was. My name is Kate Dorsey. For the past 2 years, I had been writing policy summaries in an office on the 4th floor of the UN Interstellar Command building in Geneva. My office had one window. That window looked directly at a concrete wall. I had named the wall Gerald. Gerald and I had an understanding built on mutual indifference, and until that morning, it had suited me perfectly. The man who pulled me out of that office was General Leon Hart. He had a face that had stopped registering surprise sometime around his early 40s and never started again. He walked in at 6 in the morning without knocking, stood in the doorway and said 3 words. "Meridian 2's gone." Then he waited for me to stand up. I stood up. The briefing room was on the 14th floor. 11 people sat around a long table. I recognized 6 of them. The other 5 had the particular look of people who had not slept in over 30 hours, which meant they had been in that room since before the news broke publicly. The holographic display at the center of the table was already running the footage when I took my seat. No one offered me coffee. That was how I knew this was serious. The Kethvari had arrived at the Meridian 2 colony at approximately 3:40 Standard Time, 3 days earlier. The colony held 40,000 people. Farmers, engineers, scientists, and children born on that soil who had never seen Earth. People who had spent the better part of a decade building something real and permanent in a frontier system that most people on Earth could not find on a star chart without help. The Kethvari ships had not communicated before acting. There was no ultimatum, no demand, no warning sent ahead. They entered the system, positioned themselves in orbit above the largest settlement, and began what their own internal records would later describe as a territorial assertion. I watched the footage. I did not speak. The man 2 seats to my left was a younger analyst named Ben Marsh, someone I had met at 3 interstellar policy conferences and one forgettable social event in Brussels. Halfway through the footage, he put his face in his hands. I watched his shoulders move and I did not look away from the display. There was a styrofoam cup of cold coffee sitting in front of me. I kept almost picking it up and not picking it up. The coffee was the color of an apology, the temperature of one too. When the footage ended, General Leon Hart began laying out everything we knew about the Kethvari. I will compress it here because the raw intelligence briefing lasted 40 minutes and the details, while important to the analysts in that room, are not where the story lives. The Kethvari were a spacefaring civilization that held roughly a 300-year technological advantage over humanity in terms of interstellar travel and propulsion. They had been aware of our existence for approximately 20 years. In those 20 years, they had studied us with the careful attention of a chess player reviewing an opponent's recorded games. They had mapped our political structures, cataloged our military capability, and identified what they believed to be our fundamental behavioral pattern in response to provocation. That pattern in their assessment was this: we debate, delay, issue formal protests, apply limited sanctions, and eventually retreat to a negotiating table where we accept outcomes from a position of weakness rather than strength. They were not wrong about the pattern. That is the part that sits in the back of your throat and does not go down easily. They had run their calculations on humanity and concluded that we would absorb the loss of Meridian 2 the same way we had absorbed every previous provocation from every source over the past century. We would grieve loudly and act quietly. We would convert our outrage into paperwork. They had studied what we showed the galaxy, and they had drawn a reasonable conclusion. The problem was that they had misidentified what they were actually looking at. When Hart finished his briefing, the room stayed quiet for a moment. Then Grace Pullman, who represented the Interstellar Relations Council and had the exhausted look of someone who had spent 2 years carefully constructing a diplomatic framework and just watched it be disregarded completely, spoke from the far end of the table. We have submitted 11 formal communications to the Kethvari High Seat over the past 26 months, she said. We have proposed joint territorial frameworks. We have requested dialogue. We have sent delegations that were received with what their protocol office called courtesy and then never followed up on. Filed, I said. Yes, filed, acknowledged and archived, no substantive response, no engagement of any kind. I picked up the coffee cup, finally drank what was in it, cold. Of course it was cold. Then we are done trying the other approach, I said. Something shifted in the room. Not visibly, not loudly, but I felt it the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Commander Dorsey, Hart said. He used the title deliberately. He had not used it when he walked into my office on the 4th floor. What are you suggesting? Get me a direct encrypted channel to the Kethvari High Seat. No council filtering. No diplomatic intermediaries. Direct. I set the cup back down. And get me the woman who wrote the Cascade Protocol. I want her in the room beside me when I make the transmission. Grace Pullman looked at me carefully. The Cascade Protocol has not been approved for active consideration. It is a theoretical doctrine, not an authorized action plan. It hasn't been needed before, I said. Things change. I stood up. One of the 5 people I did not recognize, one of the ones who had been awake since before the news broke, raised his hand slightly. He was young. He had the face of someone who still believed that asking questions was free. What does the Cascade Protocol actually do? He asked. Hart answered before I could. It changes the nature of this conversation, he said. Up until this point, humanity has been the party that absorbs damage and responds through established channels. The protocol shifts us into a different position. We define consequences in advance. We state them clearly, and then we deliver them without further negotiation regardless of what the other party does next. Like a warning, the young man said. One warning, I said, exactly one. I walked toward the door. And after the warning, he asked. I stopped walking but did not turn around. We keep our word, I said, which is the one variable they have not modeled for because they have never seen us do it. I left the room. The elevator ride down to collect my things from the 4th floor took about 40 seconds. Through the window of the elevator, I could see the concrete wall of the adjacent building. For just a moment, I thought about 40,000 people who had built their lives on a world that no longer existed. I thought about a colony ship I had commanded 11 years ago and a 4-minute evacuation delay that I have counted every single morning since. Then I stopped thinking about it, because memory does not move the problem. Only action moves the problem. I went to get my coat. The woman who wrote the Cascade Protocol was named Diana Crane. She was 58 years old and she had the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from having thought a thing all the way to its end and made peace with what you found there. She met me in a secured room on the 7th floor 2 hours after the briefing ended, and she did not shake my hand when I walked in. She simply looked at me and said, I wondered when they would finally call. You have been waiting, I said. Since Meridian 1, she said, which was before your time with this department but not before mine. I sat down across from her. Between us was a blank writing pad, 2 pens, and another cup of terrible coffee. I had started to wonder if there was a building-wide policy against good coffee, or whether it was simply that no one had time to care. Walk me through the protocol, I said. You have read it. I want to hear you say it. Diana Crane folded her hands on the table. The Cascade Protocol is a doctrine of pre-declared consequence, she said. It is not a military strategy in the traditional sense. It does not describe tactics or engagement formations. It describes something simpler and more significant than that. It says, if a non-human civilization attacks human populations and demonstrates, through repeated action, an inability to be deterred by diplomatic means, then humanity reserves the right to issue a single, unambiguous statement of future consequence. That statement is delivered once. It is not negotiated. It is not withdrawn. And then, regardless of the response from the other party, it is carried out. One warning, I said. One warning, she agreed. Because 2 warnings teach the wrong lesson. 2 warnings say, we will tell you again. 1 warning says something different. It says, we told you. I looked at the blank pad in front of me. I need to write the message. I know. Any guidance from the original drafting committee? Diana Crane considered that for a moment. The committee spent 4 months arguing about tone, she said. About whether the message should reference international law, shared values, the rights of sapient beings under galactic convention. 4 months of that. Then one of the members, a military historian named Owen Slade, stood up and said that none of it mattered because we were not writing for the Kethvari. We were writing for everything else in the galaxy that was watching. That stopped me. Say that again, I said. The message is not actually for the Kethvari, she said. It never was. They are the occasion for it. The audience is every other spacefaring civilization that has looked at humanity and drawn the same conclusion the Kethvari drew. The message is a correction to that file. I picked up the pen. I wrote for 3 hours. I produced 37 drafts. I showed none of them to Diana Crane. She sat at the end of the table and drank her coffee and did not ask to see them, which I respected entirely. The first 16 drafts contained explanations, justifications for why this response was proportionate, necessary, and grounded in the established principles of sapient rights under galactic law. They were well-reasoned arguments. They were useless. An explanation is an invitation to debate, and this message was not an invitation to anything. The next 11 drafts were too specific about military capacity. Lists of weapons systems, fleet numbers, engagement range. That was wrong for a different reason. Specificity about method is a negotiating position. This was not a negotiation. The remaining 10 drafts were attempts to find something that was neither an explanation nor a threat but a simple, unambiguous statement of future fact. A weather report, not a promise, not a demand, a description of what was coming. The final version was 9 sentences long. I will not reproduce all 9 sentences here. Some of them belong to the historical record and not to this account. But I will tell you that the 9th sentence, the last one, was the one that took the longest to write. Not because I was uncertain about whether to include it. I was certain. It took longest because I understood in the moment of writing it that once it was sent, it could not be unsent. That there was a version of humanity that existed before that sentence, and a version that would exist after, and those 2 versions were not entirely the same. The 9th sentence was, your worlds will burn. Not may burn, not will burn if you continue, not we reserve the right to respond in kind. No conditions attached, no timeline, no diplomatic softening around the edges. Your worlds will burn. I read it back to myself 3 times. Then I handed the pad to Diana Crane. She read it once, looked up at me, looked back at the pad. This is correct, she said. Not good, not strong, correct. It needs to go out on every frequency they monitor, I said. Translated into all 4 Kethvari dialect clusters. Their formal diplomatic register, their military operational register, their civil broadcast register, and their oldest written language, which is the one their historical texts are in. I paused. So there is no version of this they can misfile on a technical pretext. Diana Crane nodded. I will coordinate with Neil Voss in Signals. He can have the translation matrix running within 6 hours. 4, I said. She did not argue. The transmission went out at 1847 Standard Time, 73 seconds from first word to last. It was broadcast simultaneously across every frequency and sub-channel the Kethvari used for military and diplomatic communications. The translation software ran all 4 dialect versions in parallel, each calibrated not just for language but for cultural register, meaning the message did not simply translate words, it translated the weight behind them. I was in the signals room when it went out. Neil Voss was at the primary console. He was a quiet man, mid-40s, the kind of technician who cared more about precision than drama. He ran the final confirmation check, looked back at me and said, "Transmission complete. Message delivered." "Any response from their monitoring stations?" I asked. "Silence," he said, "but their signal traffic has increased significantly. They are talking to each other." Good, I thought, let them talk. I went back to my office on the 4th floor. Gerald, the concrete wall, was exactly where I had left him. I sat at my desk and looked at nothing in particular and thought about the 9 sentences I had just sent across the void to a civilization that had taken 40,000 lives and called it administrative process. I thought about whether I felt certain. The answer was yes. Not comfortable, not peaceful, not satisfied, but certain the way you are certain of arithmetic. You check the numbers and the numbers say what they say regardless of how you feel about them. 11 hours later, the Kethvari response arrived. Neil Voss sent it to me directly. I opened it on my desk terminal. It was a single paragraph in their formal diplomatic register, which their translation matrix rendered clearly. The communication attributed to Commander Kate Dorsey of the United Earth Interstellar Command has been received, logged, and filed with the High Seat's diplomatic archive. The High Seat does not acknowledge unilateral declarations of consequence from non-treaty signatory parties as carrying legal or practical binding force under galactic convention. No further response is required or intended. Received, logged, filed. I leaned back in my chair. I looked at Gerald. Gerald looked back at me with the profound indifference of concrete. "Right," I said to no one. I opened my terminal and sent one message to Leon Hart. It said, "They filed it. Proceed with authorization requests for the Cascade Protocol. I want every governing body briefed by end of week." Then I closed the terminal. Then I sat in the quiet of my 4th floor office and thought about the difference between a civilization that files a warning and a civilization that keeps one. We were about to show them the difference. The next 3 months were not cinematic. That is the part nobody tells you. They imagine the build-up to something like the Cascade Protocol as dramatic, emergency sessions, raised voices, speeches delivered to standing crowds. The reality was 41 meetings. I attended every one of them. The Interstellar Governance Council required sign-off from 9 separate oversight bodies before the protocol could transition from theoretical doctrine to authorized action. 8 of those 9 bodies stalled. Not from malice, mostly. From the same thing that had stalled humanity for a century. The deep institutional belief that there was always one more diplomatic option that had not yet been exhausted. I understood that belief. I had held it myself once. I had sent a calm, measured response to a situation that required something else entirely, and I had arrived 4 minutes too late, and I had been counting those 4 minutes every morning since. So I understood the appeal of that belief. It was a comfortable place to stand. It was simply not always a safe one. While the oversight bodies deliberated, the Kethvari moved. 40 days after our transmission, they entered the Helios drift system. This time, the response was faster. The evacuation order went out within 2 hours of their arrival. 200,000 people were moved from 3 colony platforms in less than 18 hours. Nobody died. That was the achievement, and it was a real achievement. And also, it meant nothing about the 40 years of terraforming work that had been built into the soil and atmosphere of those worlds, or the infrastructure, or the homes, or the 3 generations of careful labor that the Kethvari erased in the same casual way you might step over something on a path without looking at it. The Helios drift action did one useful thing politically. It moved 3 of the remaining 8 stalled oversight bodies. Nothing clears institutional reluctance quite like institutional failure. The remaining bodies began their formal review the following week. During this period, I continued attending meetings. I drank a very large quantity of mediocre coffee. I gave the same presentation 17 times in 17 different rooms to 17 different groups of people who all asked the same 5 questions, which I had answered so many times that my responses had stopped feeling like words and started feeling like a recording. One morning, about 6 weeks into the review process, a young council aide named Peter Holt stopped me in the corridor outside the 11th floor conference room. He had the earnest quality of someone who had not yet learned that the world does not reward sincerity alone. "Do you think they will stop?" he said. "If we actually do this, do you think the Kethvari will stop acting this way?" I looked at him for a moment. "That is not the point of the protocol," I said. "I know what the protocol says. I am asking what you personally think." I considered that. "No," I said. "I do not think they will stop because of the action itself. I think they will stop because of what it tells them about what they have been dealing with, what we actually are. That is different from stopping because you are defeated. It is stopping because you have reread your information and realized your original assessment was wrong." Peter Holt absorbed that with the expression of someone filing it under things that are true but not comforting, which was the correct place to file it. The 9th oversight body signed off on the protocol authorization 31 days later. It came through on a Tuesday. There was no ceremony. Leon Hart sent me a one-line message that said only, "Authorization complete." I printed it. I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk. The Kethvari High Seat sent an envoy to Earth 2 weeks after that. I want to describe this moment carefully because it is the moment most frequently mischaracterized in accounts I have read since. The envoy was not a concession. They did not come because they were afraid. They came because they had decided, based on our continued internal deliberations, which they had been monitoring throughout, as we later confirmed, that the authorization process was too slow and unlikely to produce action within any meaningful window. They came to negotiate. To offer a reparations framework, which is the term a larger power uses when it wants to appear generous while retaining everything it has taken. The formal session was held in the main assembly chamber on the 3rd floor. I was present not as a primary delegate but as an observer. Claire Sutton led the Earth delegation. She was a skilled diplomat, genuinely skilled, and she managed the opening hour of the session with a precision I respected. The Kethvari envoy, described in their protocol materials as a secondary voice, their designation for a designated representative, spoke at length about the value of ongoing dialogue, shared frameworks, and the mutual benefit of establishing territorial guidelines that recognized both parties' legitimate interests. At the start of the 2nd hour, the envoy said the following, in their formal register, which our translation system rendered clearly. "The population losses incurred during territorial clarification actions in your frontier systems represent a regrettable but acceptable operational threshold within the parameters of legitimate expansion. 40,000 people from Meridian 2. Acceptable." The council member sitting directly to Claire Sutton's left, a man named Ray Ford, who represented the Pacific Alliance and who had, in my experience, the shortest distance between feeling something and showing it of anyone in that room, stood up from his chair. I put my hand on his arm. The lightest possible pressure, downward. He looked at me. "Not yet," I said quietly. The envoy was still talking. Ray Ford sat back down. He did not look satisfied with that. I was not asking him to be satisfied. I was asking him to wait. The session concluded 2 hours later without agreement. The envoy departed according to Kethvari diplomatic custom with full formal honors, escorted to their transport vessel, because that is the protocol, and protocol matters even when everything else is in motion. I watched their ship lift from the landing platform from a window on the upper floor. A thought settled in me, not dramatic, not loud, just true, the way certain things are. They came here because they believed we were still deciding. They came because the picture they had built of humanity said we could be talked around, negotiated with, managed. In 20 years of watching us, they had never once seen us do the thing we said we would do. That picture was about to change. I turned away from the window and sent one message to Leon Hart from the corridor outside. It contained 4 words: move to active phase. Ray Ford met me in the corridor the next morning. He had clearly been waiting because he was standing outside my office door with a coffee that was, for the first time in my experience of this building, actually hot. He handed it to me without comment. I took it. We walked. Active phase, he said. That is it then. That is it, I said. How long until the first movement completes? 48 hours for initial fleet positioning. Then it is Admiral Owen Slade's operation. I am specifically not going to be in the command room for it. Ray Ford looked at me sideways. Why not? Because the people in that room need to be thinking about the operation, I said. Not about whether I approve of each decision in real time. Slade knows what the doctrine requires. He does not need me watching. We walked in silence for a moment. 412 families have registered displacement claims from the Helios drift evacuation, Ray said. I received the updated list this morning. I know, I said. And from Meridian too. I know. He stopped walking. I took 3 more steps and stopped too. Kate, he said, are we the right side of this? I turned around. Ray Ford was a serious man asking a serious question, and it deserved something other than the answer I had been handing people for 41 meetings. We are the side that tried the other approach first, I said. For 26 months, 11 formal communications, 3 delegations, we tried. And when that produced nothing except more taken systems and more displaced families, we issued one warning. One. And now we are going to keep it. That is not the same as being the right side. No, I said, it is not. I'm not saying it is. He absorbed that. Then what are we? We are the side that keeps its word, I said. That may be the most important thing a civilization can be, not the most comfortable, but the most important. I left him in the corridor with that. The first fleet movement completed on schedule. Owen Slade ran a tight operation. He was the kind of commander who communicated in short declarative sentences and did not use words like approximately when he could use a specific number instead. His briefings to the Oversight Council were precise, calm, and stripped of anything that could be mistaken for hesitation or doubt. I watched one of them through a glass partition from the corridor outside and thought, that is the right man for this. The Kethvari detected the fleet positioning within 18 hours. We knew this because their diplomatic communication channels went from elevated to saturated. They were sending messages in volumes that suggested the kind of internal debate they had never imagined needing to have about humanity. Several messages were routed through the Velari Concord, an old and widely respected galactic civilization that had historically acted as a neutral intermediary. We received 3 formal requests from the Velari Concord, asking humanity to delay military action pending further dialogue. We acknowledged all 3. We did not delay. I want to be honest here about what the next phase of events looked like from where I was standing, which was not in a command room or a fleet vessel, but in a 4th-floor office in Geneva, reading operational summaries on a secure terminal. I am going to describe what I know and not dress it up as anything else. The Cascade Protocol as enacted was not a single large action. It was a series of targeted engagements against Kethvari military installations and fleet assets in the systems they had taken from us. It was not directed at civilian populations. This was not generosity. It was doctrine, written into the protocol's authorization by the 4 ethicists on the original drafting committee, 2 of whom had resigned before signing. The protocol drew a clear line between military consequence and collective punishment. That distinction mattered to us. We held to it throughout. The Kethvari responded with full military mobilization. They were, as I have said, technologically advanced. They were skilled fighters. They had a significant advantage in terms of fleet age and weapon range. What they had not fully accounted for was something Diana Crane had described to me 6 weeks earlier. We had not been building our military capability for 20 years against them. We had been building it against each other, which is a far more demanding school. Humanity had spent 10,000 years finding new ways to prevent its own destruction, and several thousand of those years finding new ways to cause it. The Kethvari had read our diplomatic history. They had not read the other kind. 3 weeks into the active phase, the first Kethvari military installation in the Helios drift system was disabled. Then the second. Then the forward staging depot they had built on the outer edge of what had been the Meridian 2 system. I was in the command center when the report came in on the Meridian 2 depot. I had not planned to be there. I had gone to speak with Neil Voss about an intercepted communication. The report came through while I was standing at his console. Someone in the room exhaled loudly. Someone else said something I will not repeat here because it did not deserve to be remembered. A third person started to stand from their seat. I walked out. Not dramatically, not with a statement. I simply walked to the door, opened it, and stood in the corridor outside. It was raining on the exterior windows at the end of the hallway. The kind of flat, gray rain a city like Geneva produces on November mornings without any apparent effort. I stood in the corridor and looked at the rain through the glass and thought about the 40,000 people from Meridian 2 whose families were somewhere on this planet or others, alive because an evacuation order had, at least this time, come fast enough. And I thought about 11 years ago when the order I gave came 4 minutes too late. And I thought about the fact that those 4 minutes are not a debt you pay. You carry them. That is what they are for. After a while, Peter Holt came out of the command center and stood nearby. Not right beside me. Just in the general area, the way a considerate person gives you room to be wherever you are without making you explain yourself. Admiral Slade is asking if you want to be briefed on the next phase staging, he said. Tell him to proceed as planned, I said. He does not need my approval on the operation. He knows the doctrine. Peter Holt nodded, then after a moment, are you all right? I thought about it honestly. I am accountable, I said. That is different from all right, but it is what is available right now. He went back inside. I stayed in the corridor a while longer. Then I went back to my office and read the full operational summary from Owen Slade and every supporting report and made notes in the margins with a red pen. Not because the reports needed corrections, but because doing something precise with my hands when everything is moving at a scale beyond individual control is how I have always managed the distance between the size of events and the size of a person. The operation ran for 63 days. I attended 32 of the 41 summary briefings. I provided written assessments to the Oversight Council for all 63 days. I slept, on average, 4 hours a night, which was 2 less than recommended and 2 more than several of my colleagues managed. On the 63rd day, Owen Slade's voice came through the command center comms channel at 600 Standard Time, and it said 7 words in the flat, precise tone he used for all communications regardless of content. The Kethvari High Seat is requesting terms. The room was very quiet for about 3 seconds. Then it was not quiet. I read the message confirmation on my terminal. I read it twice. Then I opened a new message to Leon Hart and typed, "Tell them we are willing to receive their delegation, full council presence, neutral chamber, no preconditions." I sent it. Then I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk and took out the printed message Hart had sent me when the ninth oversight body signed off, the one that said only authorization complete, and I looked at it for a moment. Then I put it back in the drawer. There was still a long road ahead. Armistice terms, reconstruction, the question of what humanity had done to itself in the process of doing what was necessary. Those were not problems that resolved on day 63. They were problems that day 63 made it possible to begin addressing. I closed the drawer. I picked up my coffee. It was still hot. The armistice negotiations lasted 4 months. I was not in the room for them. This was my own request, submitted in writing to Leon Hart 3 days after the Kethvari requested terms. The letter was brief. It said, "The negotiating team needs people in that room who can still imagine the outcome that looks like something other than aftermath. I'm not currently one of those people. Send Sutton. Send Pullman. Send people with clean hands." Hart replied in person. He came to my office on the 4th floor and sat in the chair across from my desk and looked at me for a moment before speaking. "Your hands are not dirty, Kate," he said. "They are not clean either," I said. "That is my point. Clean hands are for people who stayed home. The negotiating room needs clean hands right now." He did not argue with that. Claire Sutton led the delegation. Grace Pullman was her senior advisor. They were, by all accounts I later read, extraordinarily skilled in those sessions. The Kethvari came to the table changed in a way that was visible even through the formal language of diplomatic transcripts. Not broken, I want to be precise about this. Not humiliated, but recalibrated. There is a specific quality to a civilization that has encountered something it did not expect and has had to revise its fundamental assumptions. It is not unlike walking into a room you thought was empty and finding it occupied. They had thought they knew what humanity was. They had been wrong about the most important part of it. The terms settled were substantial without being punitive. The Helios drift systems were returned. The Meridian 2 site was formally acknowledged as a protected zone. Reparations were structured across a 12-year payment period. Joint territorial protocols were established with genuine verification mechanisms, not the performative kind. Alice Payne, a historian who had been one of the original protocol drafting committee members, told me later that the terms were the most detailed and enforceable she had seen in 20 years of working in this field. "Are you satisfied with them?" I asked her. We were in my office. She had come by to deliver a copy of the final signed document, which was a thing she did because she was the kind of person who believed physical documentation still mattered. "Satisfied," she said carefully. "That is a complicated word. Pick a less complicated one." She thought about it. "They are correct," she said. It was the same word Diana Crane had used about the warning message 9 months earlier. Correct. Not good, not just, not enough, correct. I understood that word better than any other word in this whole process. My assigned task during the armistice period was to write the doctrine document. This was what Hart gave me when I removed myself from the negotiating delegation. A formal codification of what humanity had just done, not a celebration, not a political justification, but an honest accounting. What it was, what it cost, what it must never become, and what it must never be mistaken for. I spent 6 weeks on it. The first week I did not write anything at all. I read every operational summary from Owen Slade's 63-day campaign. I read the Kethvari diplomatic transmissions from the years before Meridian 2, the ones we had intercepted and logged, the ones in which their own analysts described humanity with such clinical confidence. I read the reports from the families displaced in the Helios drift evacuations. I read testimonies from colonists who had been on the outer platforms of Meridian 2 when the evacuation order came, and had left with whatever fit into a standard issue emergency pack. One testimony stayed with me longer than the others. It was from a woman named Margaret Cole, 44 years old, a soil scientist who had worked on Meridian 2 for 9 years. She described the evacuation in plain, factual detail. Then, near the end of her statement, she wrote, "I am not angry at the response that was chosen. I understand why it was necessary. I am angry at the 11 years before it when nobody chose anything at all." I read that sentence many times over several days. Then I started writing. The doctrine document was 11 pages. The first line was, "This is not a victory document." The second line was, "A victory document describes something gained. This document describes something changed, which is not the same thing, and the difference matters." I will not reproduce the full document here, but I will tell you what its core argument was, stated plainly. Humanity had demonstrated, during the period described, the capacity to issue a clear declaration of consequence and then deliver on it without deviation. That capacity is not a military achievement. It is a political and moral one. It requires a kind of collective will that is genuinely difficult to maintain and genuinely costly to exercise. The danger, the document argued, is not that we showed we could do it. The danger is that we might decide we liked being the thing that does it, that we might stop treating it as a tool of absolute last resort and start reaching for it sooner, because sooner is faster and faster requires less patience, and patience means sitting through 41 meetings before you can move. The document contained a section I nearly cut 3 times before leaving it in. It was a single paragraph about the people on the other side of the Cascade Protocol's execution, not the Kethvari High Seat, not their military command. The ordinary people who lived on those worlds and who had not made the decisions that brought humanity's response to their doorstep, any more than the 40,000 people of Meridian 2 had made the decisions that brought the Kethvari to theirs. I did not offer a resolution to that paragraph. I left it open, the way the protocol itself had always required us to leave certain things open, not because we could not face them, but because pretending they resolve cleanly is the kind of lie that corrupts everything it eventually touches. The doctrine document was submitted to the Oversight Council on a Thursday. Hart read it overnight. He came to see me on Friday morning and sat down and said, "This is honest." "Yes," I said. "Some of the council members will have objections to the third section." "I know. They will want language that is more comfortable," I said. "Yes. Tell them the discomfort is the point," I said. "If this does not make us uncomfortable, we will do it again for the wrong reasons. The discomfort is the safeguard." Hart nodded. He left. The document was formally adopted 2 weeks later with no changes to the third section. I was home on the evening the Velari conquered message arrived. Home was a rented apartment in Geneva that I had been living in for 3 years and had not yet made to look like anything other than a place where a person sleeps between long days at an office. There was a couch. There was a window. There was, against the far wall, a small shelf with one photograph on it, a picture of the colony ship I had commanded before the assignment that led me to this building and this desk, and Gerald the concrete wall. I did not look at that photograph often, but it was there, and it was important that it was there, and I knew the difference between not looking at something and not acknowledging it. Neil Voss sent the transmission to my personal secure terminal at 2147. The header identified the sender as the Velari Conquered, which I stared at for a moment before opening. The Velari Conquered was not an organization that communicated casually. They were one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the known galaxy. Their recorded history stretched back 8,000 years, which meant they had been navigating the politics of interstellar life since before humanity had developed the written word. They had initiated contact with Earth precisely twice in recorded history. Both times were to provide navigational data that our cartographers had been unable to generate independently. Courteous, impersonal, and entirely uninvolved in human affairs. They had sent 3 requests for delay during the active phase of the Cascade Protocol. We had acknowledged all three and acted anyway. I opened the message. It was 4 words. We have been watching. That was the entire transmission. No elaboration, no diplomatic framing, no context or explanation attached to the edges of it. 4 words. I sat with those 4 words for a very long time. The first thing I felt was something I had not anticipated and did not immediately have a name for. Not pride, not relief, something closer to the sensation of pressing against a door for a long time and feeling it finally shift, just slightly, just the width of those 4 words, just enough to let through the understanding that we had been seen, that the recalibration the Kethvari had undergone was not a local event. It had moved outward through the whole galactic community at the speed of information, and what had reached a civilization 8,000 years into its history of watching others rise and fall and persist was this. Humanity, pressed far enough, carrying the weight of everyone it had been too slow to protect, would keep its word. We had been watching. The second thing I felt, arriving almost immediately behind the first, was something harder to sit with. Because those 4 words meant they had watched Meridian 2-2. They had watched the 11 years before Meridian 2. The galactic community had held enough information to form a clear picture of what the Kethvari were doing to humanity's frontier systems, and their collective assessment had been that it was not yet their concern. That is not a condemnation. It is simply the reality of how civilizations that have existed long enough operate. They watch. They wait for the situation to resolve on its own. They do not place themselves between things they believe will settle without them. So we have been watching carried 2 things inside it simultaneously. It carried acknowledgement, and somewhere deeper in it, there was an apology that would never be stated as one. I did not resent that. I understood it. Understanding something and finding it difficult are not mutually exclusive, but in this case understanding was the one I needed to carry forward. I sent a response to the Vilari conquered the following morning. It was also 4 words. We know, thank you. I do not know what they made of that. I do not know if the brevity seemed appropriate to them or strange. It was the most truthful thing I could offer. The Cascade Protocol was formally classified as a doctrine of last resort by unanimous council vote in the spring of the following year. This classification meant its use required the specific authorization pathway we had used, 9 oversight bodies, full council review, a documented record of prior diplomatic exhaustion, and could not be invoked by military command alone or at the request of individual member states without that process. Diana Crane attended the vote. I did not. I was in a hotel room near the Helios Drift System's closest Earth port, attending the opening ceremony of a new colony platform being established on one of the 3 worlds returned under the armistice terms. The ceremony was small and quiet, and attended mostly by the families of the people who had been displaced during the Kethvari occupation. There were children there who had been born in temporary housing facilities and had no memory of the worlds their parents had built. There were older people who had stood in emergency evacuation lines holding whatever they had been fast enough to grab. A young man named David Cole, he introduced himself, and yes, I made the connection immediately, approached me before the ceremony began. He was in his late teens, serious-faced, with the deliberate posture of someone who had decided to approach a difficult situation and was going to do it regardless of how it felt. You are Kate Dorsey, he said. Yes, I said. He looked at me for a moment with the kind of directness that tends to develop in people who have grown up around difficult circumstances. Because there is no reason to be indirect about hard things when hard things have been the consistent texture of your life. My mother said you were the one who wrote the warning, he said. I wrote it, yes. She said it was not enough. What happened after? She is right, I said. It was not enough to undo what had already been done. That was never what it was designed to do. He considered that. Then what was it for? I looked out past him at the platform construction behind us. the cranes and the sealed environmental domes, and the new soil importers that would spend the next 2 years rebuilding what 40 years of labor had built before. At the people gathering near the ceremonial markers, some of them looking up at a sky they were reclaiming, some of them looking at the ground. It was a correction, I said, to a serious and costly misunderstanding about what humanity is, about what we will and will not accept, and about what happens when the line between those two things is crossed without acknowledgement. Did it work? He said. I thought about the Velari transmission, about the territorial disputes that had been quietly dropped without explanation in the months since the armistice, about the unprecedented number of trade and cooperation requests that had reached Earth in that same period, about the fact that in 18 months, no other civilization had taken any action in any human system that could be described as a territorial assertion. We will see, I said. Give it time. These things take time to settle into the truth of themselves. He nodded. He looked like he was filing that in the same place Peter Holt had filed things under true but not entirely satisfying, which was, in my experience, the most accurate category for most important truths. The ceremony began. I stood near the back and watched. Afterward, I returned to my hotel room. I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my document terminal and looked at the blank 12th page of the doctrine document. The page I had left empty when I submitted it, the one Hart had not asked about and I had not explained. I picked up my pen. I wrote, "Humanity does not want to be this. That is perhaps the only thing left to hold on to. Not as an absolution, we are well past the point where absolution is a useful concept, but as a direction, as a line drawn between the civilization that keeps its word when there is no other option, and the civilization that keeps its word because it has grown to prefer the version of itself that does. Those two civilizations look identical from the outside. From the inside, they are everything apart. We must remain the first kind. We owe that much to the 40,000 who could not wait for us to figure it out, and to the 4 minutes that taught me what waiting costs." I stopped. I read it back. Outside the window, the colony platform lights were coming on against the early dark. Below them, through the environmental seal, families were walking back to temporary quarters that would, over the next several years, become permanent ones. A world being rebuilt, people doing the quiet, essential thing humans do when given space and time, and the basic security of knowing the ground beneath them will hold. I left the paragraph in. I closed the terminal. I picked up my coffee. It was still hot. I drank it slowly, looking out at the lights, and I let the night be what it was.